First of all, I've been asked to let people know that there is a 2-day workshop here in CRASSH starting tomorrow morning at 9 on ideas of India in Britain, 1857 to 1947. And I've been told to tell you that there are still places for that workshop open. Otherwise, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Sheldon Pollock, since 2005 the William B. Ransford Professor of Sanskrit at the Columbia University in New York. Ransford Professor of Sanskrit and Indian Studies, actually. And Professor Pollock is here invited as a distinguished visiting speaker on the Mellon CDI, the Disciplinary Innovation, which suits very well Shelley Pollock as an innovator. Professor Pollock was a student at Harvard, where he started out studying classics before moving on to Sanskrit, and did his doctorate aspects of versification in Sanskrit lyric poetry under the supervision of the legendary Professor Daniel H. Ingalls. In 1975, after he got his doctorate, he first was at the University of Iowa, and since then has had a very distinguished career at the University of Chicago, where he was George V. Bobrinskoy Professor of Sanskrit and Indic Studies from 1989. I know we are getting older, but not that old yet.
And I've got the grades.
Professor Pollock has published widely on topics ranging from epics and literary theory to cosmopolitanism, and he has been the driving force and principal investigator in several international collaborative research projects, among them Literary Cultures in History, Reconstructions from South Asia, and Indian Knowledge Systems on the Eve of Colonialism. He has been the editor of the Clay Sanskrit Library and is currently the founding editor of the new Murti Classical Library of India series, which Harvard University Press will start publishing in 2013. He is also the editor of another series, Historical Source Books in Classical Indian Thought, which will be published in 12 volumes by Columbia University Press. I could go on, as Pollock himself has gone on, but suffice it to say that he has also a deep knowledge of Kannada, roughly the main language of the modern Indian state of Karnataka, both in its contemporary and classical forms. Earlier this year, Professor Pollock was awarded Padma Shri by the government of India, an honor not often bestowed on non-Indians. Professor Pollock has recently turned his scholarly attention towards philology. Last year, an article appeared in the journal Critical Enquiry entitled Future Philology, with a question mark at the end. And he also published an article in the Hindu, as you know, a leading Indian newspaper, on Kannada, pointing out that the language had recently been granted official status as one of the classical languages of India. But Pollock asked, what is the point in that if nobody can read classical Kannada any longer? Today he will speak to us on these and related matters, and I welcome Professor Pollock to deliver his lecture on the great chain of academic being, a view from the bottom. Reflections on the non-Western, the non-modern, and the philological. Professor Pollock.
Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. I should correct you, my knowledge of Kannada is restricted to Hala Kannada, unfortunately. So I'm always being cheated at the bazaar as a result of that. I do want to thank Mary Jacobus, who persistently invited me until it became mean-spirited to say no to her. That was very sweet of her. And Andrew Webb, who leapt into the breach when Mary left, probably because I was coming. I don't know why Mary left. Andrew, thank you so much, and Michelle for all your hard work in dealing with a very difficult man at a long distance. If I had my druthers, I would probably talk about my new project, which is about the history of the Sanskrit discourse on aesthetic response. But Mary and Andrew, this being the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, they wanted a presentation on disciplinarity. So that's what I'm going to talk about, disciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, with the inter in parentheses, which I'm going to take very seriously, because I'm not sure I really believe in the interdisciplinarity. But also, I noticed that part of the research project for CRASSH has to do with the future of the university, sustainability. I'm not sure exactly what that means in the context of the university, but I have a sense of what is at stake. I have a very distinct sense of how about the time is running out on certain forms of knowledge, and that's what I do want to talk about. Now, I have a rather longish paper. I was told I should talk for about an hour. If I see your eyes rolling back, I'll pull the plug. But and normally I don't prepare written text for my lectures, but I did this time because this, in some ways, is going to be the introduction to a book, or maybe not the introduction. We'll find a way into a book that I am under contract to write, and that's a good thing to be under contract because you're forced to write it. Called now Liberation Philology, and it's a meditation on the future of a set of knowledge practices that are very important to me, and I think to the human race, actually, as a whole. So, but let me start with talking about, I have a subtitle to this paper, Reflections on the NonWestern, the Non-Modern, and the Philological, and I'm going to move through those individual topics in the course of my talk, but I want to start off with a discussion of the sorrows of disciplinarity. I think we've all experienced them, with some exceptions. I think the historians have gotten off lightly, and I'm going to revert to the historians since we have some distinguished representatives in our audience today. So I want to start talking about a little bit about disciplinarity in general, the critique of disciplinarity in the last 30 years, incessant critique of disciplinarity, where it's gotten us and where it might not have gotten us, and then move through these other subcategories of the non-Western, the non-modern, and the philological. Those three qualifiers today constitute a very serious disadvantage for any scholar. Singly, for sure, altogether crippling, and I will show you why I say that in a moment. If you are a non-Western, pre-modern philologist, you are hurled, I have a number of Miltonian citations, you are hurled headlong flaming from the ethereal sky. And what I want to do at the end of the talk, after describing some of these issues, is ask whether there might be a new form of disciplinarity to help these fallen angels return to heaven. I'm not sure about that part of my talk, to be honest with you, and I'd be very grateful to hear what you have to say. And I should say that the problems I'm dealing with are much bigger. They're much bigger than I am capable of addressing. You all know the distinction that Foucault. I'm going to have to invoke Foucault, of course. The distinction he drew between the universal and the specific intellectual. And I think we all grew up believing we were Sartrean-like universal intellectuals, arbiters of justice, and so on. And I think as we grow older, we get smaller and more specific, and that's what I'm interested in now, these very specific problems of my institutional location and how to deal with them and correct them and so on. I start with disciplinarity. I am telling none of you anything new when I raise the question of disciplinary unhappiness. It seems to me the last 3 decades in higher education have been about anything. They've been about this unhappiness and discontent. I guess there is no discipline that's worth the name of discipline that's escaped unmutilated by these self-criticisms. And by the way, I'm not saying that self-criticism wasn't necessary. I think in many cases it's been essential, at least where it's increased historical self-reflection and methodological awareness. What I am saying is that in some cases it seems that disciplinary critique, was what the disciplines have become. That's all they seem to be about. Anthropology, there may be an anthropologist or so in the audience, I don't know, but if there is, I suppose you'll recognize some truth in when I talk about the critique of anthropology that's been going on for 25 years, where the anthropology of anthropology itself has become a sort of sub-discipline, a kind of narcissistic ethnography of the field. I mean, it's really quite astonishing. Consider political science. In the last 11 years, we can actually date the critique of political science with the rise of the Perestroika movement, which kind of came out of places like Chicago, not unexpectedly. If you don't know about the Perestroika movement, it was a group of faculty and students who attacked this is a quote, the narrow parochialism and methodological bias toward the quantitative, behavioral, rational choice, statistical, and formal modeling approaches of their field. Very good book just came out from Yale on the Perestroika movement. It's a terrific collection. And there you can see the critique of political science at the coal face. It's really quite inspiring in some ways. Just a few weeks ago, I was in New Orleans addressing the American Comparative Literature Association. They have a tendency to invite marginal scholars from marginal fields to get a view from the distant. So that's what I was doing there. And so I read their reports. They have decennial reports. That's part of the bylaws of this association. Every 10 years they have to do a self-criticism. It's very Maoist, isn't it? 93 and 2004. And what the comparative literature does is very interesting. They decided to solve the problem of comparative literature by first getting rid of comparativism. That's not done anymore. And then they decided to get rid of literature. So that's one way that's a serious disciplinary critique. And then, of course, Gayatri said, you're all going to die, right? The death of the discipline. And one of my most favorite cases is economics. Now, I don't have time to go into detail, but I would love to tell you about Chicago economics and Columbia economics, but no time right now. But there is something now called post-autistic economics. Not a moment too soon, spreading from France and working its corrosive magic. And I do have one of my dear colleagues in New York is part of a group headed by, I don't know whether you could say that it's a cephalous group, Michel Callon in Paris and Tim Mitchell in New York, describing how the object of economics is actually produced by economists. Economics makes markets. That's the title of a book published by Princeton last year, and I invite you to read it. And of course, of all the disciplinary foci, Oriental Studies, the very phrase has become a toxin. To say you're an Orientalist is basically to commit suicide now. And I noticed actually that and I was surprised. Am I right that Cambridge has changed the name of the Oriental faculty, capitulating to the critique? So it goes. Not that this is a critique that should not have been made, but I'm not sure that these nominalistic capitulations is really what we've got to be doing to take the critique seriously. And of course, then so those are some major players in the game of the great chain of academia I want to talk about. There are others. Bert is here, and we talked about this recently, the rise and fall of linguistics. This is not so much a discipline that fell to its own critique, but the discipline that wrote itself out of human discourse in some way. It just, I don't know if others of you share this, but when I was a kid in the other Cambridge, linguistics was the queen of the sciences. We lived and died by the next article by people at MIT or Harvard. And I haven't read a linguistics article in 25 years. Anyway, so but that's another story, the sort of meteoric rise and crash of linguistics in the last 30 years. Now, it's very interesting what institutionally has happened as a result of these critiques of the disciplines, the rise of the studies movement, women's studies, race studies, gender studies, film studies, and the rise of new institutional structures like CRASH or the Humanities Institute at Chicago or at Columbia to house these eccentric forms of knowledge practices. But here's a very interesting thing about all of this. And this is something I'm not making up. As of last month, the top 25 U.S. universities have more interdisciplinary research institutes, committees, programs. Each university has more than 100. Then they have disciplinary units. So if I have time, I'll cite Marshall Solins on the clutter, and as he says, all that clutters is not gold, for the disciplinary clutter. So it looks like the whole thing is falling apart. Internal critique, the rise of the studies, the clutter that's not gold, and people seem to be solving the disciplinary muddle simply by walking away from their departments. But in fact, that is all an illusion. That is all an illusion. The power structure, now I'm talking, my point of reference, I should have said at the very beginning, is the American university. What's happening in France or here or in Germany or in India, a point that I will revert to, the most important point for me of all. That world may be slightly different, but the power of the disciplines in the American university is basically, as I see it, basically unchallenged. All the big ticket elements in a institutional environment, budgets, hiring, firing, things of that sort, space, the most important, New York City, the most important thing of all, space, professional organizations, for example. The disciplinary structure that was put in place in 1895 is basically, as I see it, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, completely unshaken by all of this chatter. But what has changed, and this is what's I'm really interested in, what has changed is the constitution of the disciplines and the nature of their hierarchical ordering. This is going to take me to my great chain of being. The elements, I feel, are largely the same. It's their relationship to each other that's changed so radically. Now, as I look at this, let me take a sip of this coffee. As I look at this hierarchy, I return to my Miltonian imagery, because I think that's the correct idiom in which to represent this structure of power. And let me describe it for you. At the top of the great chain of academic being, high in the scholarly empyrean, in the sphere of the seraphim and the cherubim, you will find economics. It's interesting that the natural sciences have their own universe, which is really problem-driven, not discipline-driven. It's an interesting and important, but for our purposes, not relevant distinction. From the domain of the cherubim and seraphim, where economics holds sway, you descend to the middle realms, the realm of the thrones and the dominations and the principalities and the powers of political science. Sociology, you might once have thought, would be up there in the lower end of the principalities and dominations, but it's now, nobody takes sociology seriously anymore. It's just, I mean, I was talking to somebody, I think David, Washburn recently. At Chicago, the mighty Chicago School of Sociology is reduced to sex surveys. That's what they do. That's what they do, sex surveys. And then you go down below the principalities and powers of political science to the angels and archangels of history. Of course, there is a hierarchy in the history department, the modern historians on top, and maybe the medievalists further down, the dusty non-modernists. And it's very interesting. It's very interesting. I wish we had time. I wish I had put this into the paper. How history has escaped, really, the disciplinary critique. I mean, who critiqued history? It was, it was weirdos like Hayden White, outsiders, narratologists. But real deep critique of the historical method did not come out of the history department. They have simply carried on in blithe indifference to the chatter and have profited mightily, I might say. Maybe they know something we don't know. Keep your mouth shut. All right, now my list of angels becomes a little more complex. We have something called the hypophania, or the lower spirits we're getting into the terrestrial domain. At the top of this we find anthropology, but it's too close to the earth to really have any angelic qualities. And then on the earth itself come the Western humanities. Philosophy is at the very top, seeking to escape the mud in which it's caught, the mud of human history. And it's really astonishing. I digress, but I can't. If you go to the top program in the United States, top program in philosophy is NYU. NYU has something like 40 full professors or tenure-track professors of philosophy. Fully half of them do philosophy of mind. Fully half. I think there's one historian of philosophy. And of course, the historians of economics, where are they? More about that later. Philosophy is at the top. And then, there's some very interesting adjustments in the hierarchy. You might have said 20 years ago, literary theory. Literary theory, as you know, has crashed and burned across the academy. And so much so that there are great university presses. I will not name them. Well, I will. University of California, at Berkeley, that press will not publish literary theory anymore. How is that for a transvaluation of values? Huh? Wow. But there, from the terrestrial garden of the great chain of academic being, you descend into the Nether World. And in the Nether World, the NonWest resides. But recapitulating in the inferno, the hierarchies above them. So at the top of the infernal world where the non-West resides are the social sciences, political science, and economics, if there is such a thing. Then history. Further down, non-Western literary studies. And at the very bottom of this chain, and the nethermost abyss, at the floor of the burning lake, I live. That's where I am. Non-modern, non-Western philology. It's actually just a crossword puzzle clue these days. Now, obviously, I'm not an unbiased observer of these disciplinary wars. I have a nice Gramscian analogy here. I think there's been sort of a war of position among the professoriate attempting to the sort of intellectual insurrection and wars of maneuver among the bureaucrats, but no more about that now. But I want to say, that there are a lot of people who feel the same sort of disciplinary shame and sorrow that I feel. I mean, consider theology. What happened to theology? The queen of the medieval university. I mean, it's taken a real serious hit. But I want to say, go back to the main topic. I think Asian studies, and this is also a phrase that needs finer nuancing. Asian studies as a whole has been affected by this disciplinary reordering, or at least a great part of non-Western studies. There's also, as you know, a hierarchy across oppressed communities. I mean, the oppressed communities build their own hierarchies of oppression. So at the top of the oppressed non-West is East Asia, and then somewhere in the Middle East, just a notch below the Middle East, South Asia, and then at the bottom, Africa. That's the order of hierarchy among the oppressed. Now, I want to tell you, there's a certain amount of, it might be viewed as washing dirty laundry in public when I talk about the department of which I am a member. But in some ways, that department embodies the large, almost world historical forces that have produced the situation that I'm trying to describe here. I'd like just to review the history of the naming of this department. Continuing my Maoist theme, the rectification of names of the department over the last 100 years has been very interesting. But I should tell you that my personal history has nothing to do with the Columbia story I'm about to tell you. My training, you might say, that my intellectual ontology recapitulates the European phylogeny of Indology. How is that for a phrase? What I mean is I was trained as a classicist because in the 1960s it was still thought that India was part of this Indo-European world. So the Columbia scene is rather difficult. I'm going to move through this very quickly. But the department that I belong to now was founded in 1890. It was called then Oriental Languages, as you might expect. The Indo-Iranianists left to join a new department of general and comparative linguistics that was founded by Franz Boas in the 20s or 30s, I think. And in 1954, the Indo-Iranians found that they were being subsumed and drowned out, overwhelmed by the linguists, and returned to the department, which they renamed the Department of Near and Middle East Languages. I don't know where India is still, but never mind. In 1965, they were joined by historians and international affairs people, and sometimes government people, government studies, and economists. This is the mid-60s. I'll tell you why this was pertinent. And then they changed the name to Middle East Languages and Cultures. In 92, the arrival of some Indians, they prompted a new change name to Middle East and Asian Languages and Cultures. They didn't want to add the S. That was all right. And this last year, we added Africa. So we had to rectify names again. And we came up with the absolutely anodyne term, Middle East, South Asian, and African Studies. We having realized the less you say, the better off you are. And when I think back, there had been discussions about possible names. I mean, you see, this is not simply about naming, is it? This is about a form of knowledge, a form of training, sets of problematics, things that you care about, stuff you want to learn, you want your students to learn, ways of organizing your thinking. It's not just about names. So we sat down, kicked around some names: Regional and Comparative Languages and Cultures, lousy acronym; Regional and Comparative Studies; Post-Aerial and Comparative Studies; Post-Colonial Studies; Post-Orientalist Studies. And then somebody said, let's just call ourselves Oriental Studies. Ad fontes. You know? But anyway, in the history, what I want to suggest. It sounds. I'm being slightly silly and jejune about this, but in the heart of all of this is some really important issues lie buried, and I want to get into those now. And one of the key things is the place of the non-West in the American university in 2010. As I said a moment ago, without sounding self-important, Milak's or Mesas's problems over the last 100 years really do recapitulate a long history of interaction with Asia in a whole range of ways. And the critiques of these kinds of interactions, every time there was a name change, of course, there's a critique that goes with it. And the critiques have been very substantial and important. The critique of an old-style philology, for example, which is informed by a positivism hostile to theory in practice, while laden with theory in fact. Most philologists don't fully understand how relatively recent their philological theory is that drives their practice. Orientalism, the critique of Orientalism, which was real. It was, Said overstated, overdrove it with very noxious consequences, but there have been real entanglements with projects of colonization of minds and polities. Part of the critique was that of area studies, which reified civilizational boundaries. I mean, it became impossible, given the way area studies were set up in the United States, to do South and Southeast Asian studies or South and Central Asian studies. Whole areas of interaction, spheres of circulation, were elided by the Department of Education. It was absolutely astonishing. I mean, there are real consequences to these things. And finally, one of our critiques has to do with the very idea of Western disciplinarity, especially in the social sciences, which takes singular facts and turn them into universal theories. That's what social science seems to do all the time. But the outcome of this, as you can maybe imagine from this name Mesas, is disciplinary chaos, if not disorder. And I think one of the key things, this gets to my point of the non-Western, my first topic here. The part of the key of this is the final collapse of area studies and the expulsion, to continue my biblical metaphor, the expulsion of non-Western scholarship from American social sciences. I have very decisive views of decisive. I have very distinct views about the critique of area studies. And I was part of the Social Science Research Council Committee on South Asia in the 90s, one of the few real area studies units in the American landscape, which was destroyed by David Featherman and his cronies after a 40-year run over precisely certain kinds of questions relating to globalization. That area studies was somehow incapable of asking trans-areal questions. AIDS, climate change, global migration. How do these little regional committees ask post-regional, trans-regional kinds of questions? That's not a dumb critique. But what I think... I think I think what's happened as a result of this is that area-based social science has nowhere to go. Once upon a time, they could have had the area studies people could have been appointed to an institute. They could have had a home in political science or in economics or in sociology. And once those area studies units were destroyed, those guys had nowhere to go. So they came to MELAC. They have been basically exiled from the social sciences discipline and dumped in these now kind of area studies programs, redivivus, in fact. Just to give you an astonishing example, Columbia University has a very distinguished political science department. It's ranked number 7 in the world or something. They're always counting their rankings. This is a department without a single Middle East political scientist, without a single South Asian political scientist. They're in MELAC or Mesas. There's no conversation whatsoever going on with the hard social sciences. Those guys have just been ditched. So the point I want to impress upon you, and I'm going to keep my eye on the time. The point I want to impress upon you, I think this is a deep and, as far as I can see, largely unstudied problem. The exile of area located knowledge from the social sciences and the consequent reconfiguration of departments like my own. I mean, it's rather odd in the era of globalization that social science should be so stubbornly indifferent, it would seem, to real located knowledge. But that's an antinomy that seems to be the case. But with the outcome of this, it seems to me, is raises very large problems for disciplinarity. What is it now that colleagues have been driven out of the social science? What does it mean for a discipline like mine? Okay, I hope that made at least some sense. The point I want you to take away from that little excursus is that the xenophobia, as it were, of modern social sciences in the United States is producing a disciplinary paralysis for many parts of the humanities that are focused on things like textual knowledge. Returning to that in a second. The second point I want to make, reflections on the non-Western and the non-modern, is my second point. Now, I can be rather quicker about this because I don't have as much data as I would like to have. But I think it's a very profound issue that many of you will no doubt intuitively acknowledge when I start talking about it. The second expulsion is the expulsion of the past from the university. Now, I've been interested in this for a very long time, but I don't have a really good critique. I don't have a really deep understanding. I'm going to cite you two texts because I want you to show that there are other people who feel that what I feel, and then give you a very brief and partly undigested philosophical account of this expulsion of the past from the contemporary university. And again, contemporary university means like Columbia or Chicago or Harvard. I remember I have the data actually, 1987, Norbert Elias published an article. And this was the opening. Norbert Elias is a very interesting figure in his own right because he embodies a form of knowledge which in the United States is now dead, historical sociology. I mean, there is sort of the Scotch Pole sort of positivist sort of history, but these Weberian kind of historical sociologists still exist in Europe. I don't know around here, but in the continent, that's for sure. They're still there, but nobody in the United States takes them seriously. They would never be hired by a social science department. It's a form of knowledge. I mean, Weber would not be hired, actually. And Elias, the civilizing process, all of that stuff, a terrific, a wonderful scholar of the sort we don't see anymore. But he wrote this article in 1987, begins by saying, not much attention has been paid to the retreat of sociologists into the present. The Retreat of Sociologists into the Present. And the name of the article is The Retreat of Sociologists into the Present. But it's an interesting article, but unfortunately Elias doesn't tell us why there's been this retreat. He says there shouldn't be a retreat. We can learn a lot from the past. I agree. But why this retreat has taken place, Elias leaves us completely in the dark. So too my second source, a rather different character, T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, many of you will have read this essay as a student's What is a Classic? I reread that recently for a lecture on the classics. It's not a very good study. It is very provincial. He has a very narrow vision of what the classics, but he did get one thing right. And let me read you what he got right. And he, of course, being the poet is, it's a beautiful, actually pathos-laden statement. In our age, said Eliot, there is coming into existence a new kind of provincialism, which perhaps deserves a new name. It is a provincialism not of space, but of time. One for which history is merely the chronicle of human devices which have served their turn and been scrapped. One for which the world is the property solely of the living, a property in which the dead hold no shares. Now, I think those guys, Eliot and Norbert Elias, are onto something. They're onto something very, very profound about the evacuation of the past in the present moment. And I've seen this. You know, you're on hiring committees, nobody wants to hire a pre-modernist. Snore, boring, no pre-modernists. Let's do something, let's get contemporary India. Of course, contemporary India should be on the map, of course. But the constant complaint about the non-modern is just astonishing in American universities. And unmistakable. But how do you make sense of it? Why then? We're universities, you know, we're not widget factories. Well, you know, what is it about, how do you explain this? Well, I was rereading, partly because it was reviewed in it wasn't the TLS, London Review of Books recently, some of a new work of course, my senior moment here. A new work of Fred Jameson's, The End of Temporality, 2003. I never read that essay. I urge you to take a look at it. I think Jameson, of course, perhaps the most pompous, jargon-laden, turgid and turbid writer on the face of the earth, but a man who often has profound insight if you are willing to work through the verbiage to get there. And I think The End of Temporality really captures something very important. I mean, let me put it in a nutshell. Well, not try to read this for you. As I understand it, you know, the rise of classical historiography, the Rankas and the Michelets and all those guys in the 19th century, well, where did that come from? Jameson says it comes from the disappearance of the past. I mean, for those classical historians, they could see the past disappearing and wanted to capture the difference from the present. That past, says James, and I will read to this point. That sense, he says James, the very sense of an alternate temporality disappears as well. I missed the first part. When the peasantry shrinks to a picturesque remnant, this is Jameson, when suburbs replace the villages, and modernity reigns triumphant and homogeneous over all space, then the very sense of an alternate temporality disappears as well, and postmodern generations are dispossessed, without even knowing it, of any differential sense of that deep time, the first moderns, he's talking about Ranka-type people, that deep time the first moderns sought to inscribe in their writing. I think there's some real truth to that. I'm sure that's a rather monocausal view of the world, and I'm sure there are a lot more factors involved. And I see, you know, that there is now, François Hartog has a book called Le Présentisme, a régime d'historicité. Le Présentisme. Now, I sound really smart, but I haven't read that book yet. But it's on a lot of people's minds. I think his view is a little bit different. I think presentism for Hartog is not a serious problem. It's just a sign of modernity. For me, it is a major problem. The liquidation of the past and the future, as Jameson calls it. Let me cut to the chase here, but that's the philosophical side of things. What are the sort of institutional, how does it cash out institutionally? Well, here's a very interesting fact. History in the United States, the academic structure, the academic history, what should we call it, industry, half of the dissertations in the last year that they were counted, half the dissertations were American history of the last 100 years. Now, that captures both the two provincialisms, the provincialism of time and the provincialism of space. But now I can go into even greater detail, but I won't because time is running, regarding comparative literature. But I gave a talk to them, and so I figured I'd better, learn something about the institutional organization of comparative literature. I won't go into any detail except to say that if you do a statistical analysis of who is appointed in comparative literature departments and what are they writing, you will find, and I'm prepared to defend this figure, you will find, I want to make sure I give you the right figure. you will find that 90% of comparative literature graduate education and research today is directed toward a mere 3% of human literary experience. That's sunk in. 90% of all the chatter about comparative literature is directed to the thinnest layer of human literary experience. Europe in the last 100 years, maximum. All right, so you get a sense of what my still slightly underdeveloped analysis of the non-Western and the non-mono. Let me talk now about the third serious impediment or disadvantage that a scholar can willingly take upon herself or himself, namely the philological. And since philology had its moment of such grandeur in Germany, let me read you a German sentence from Die Zeit from a couple of years ago. This was a review of a couple of books on philology. Die Philologie gehört zu den bemitleidenswertesten Disziplinen der heutigen Universität. Philology belongs to the most pitiable disciplines of today's university. And as I've said, we talked about this on Tuesday, and I mentioned this in a recent essay. You go out in the streets of Cambridge, England, and you stop 10 people. I bet 9 of them will not have the faintest idea what philology is. In fact, who was it? Maybe it was somebody in this room who said he got a email from a colleague, Cambridge PhD in English, a couple of days ago, asking him to explain to her what philology is. Now, that is not sneering. It is a barometer of where we philologists, wir Philologen, where we have come. Talk about the burning, the bed of the burning lake. And it's very interesting. I recommend to people who are concerned about such things. It's not a good book, but it's an interesting book by William Clark called Academic Charisma. You read Clark's Academic Charisma. You look at the philology industry in Germany in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, just before the center fell out and everything dispersed. It was the dominant discipline of that world. A fact that allows us very poignantly to consider its shriveled, shrunken little self today. A self that I'm the first to state, philologists are themselves most guilty of allowing to persist. I want to just describe. I mean, how do you collect data on this? How do you make such claims? Shriveled, shrunken self of philology. I mean, you go around, you look at the world, you say who's getting appointed, what positions are there, what students are getting PhDs, and so on and so forth. And the situation is the situation for people like me on the burning lake, very, very grim. In Europe, people at this university know the situation of Sanskrit and Indian studies, and I don't have to go into that. Just consider Germany. Consider Holland. Holland, 25 years ago, had something on the order of 20 positions in Dutch Indology. Now there are 2. One in Leiden and one in Groningen. And Groningen is not really a Sanskrit position. I was talking the other day about the Collège de France. Collège de France really, for me, kind of always embodied something of this philological honor, respect for textual practices. My dear friend Fussman at the Collège de France is sort of an unofficial historian, has kept me up to date on what's going on there. His position in Sanskrit will disappear permanently when he retires. There is no classical Arabic. There's no classical philology in Arabic taught at Collège de France. There's no classical Chinese philology taught at There's no classical Semitic philology at Collège de France. It's pretty much a blasted terrain there, and that's the Collège de France, actually, where they don't have to answer to anybody, really. They don't have to answer to anybody. They answer to themselves. So it's a sort of self-inflicted wound. That's right. Now, we did speak a couple of days ago about the situation in India. I would love to, perhaps in the question and answer, I'd love to be able to go into greater detail about the situation in India. But that situation is, as I think I used the word the other day, apocalyptic. I really do feel that it's not. I mean, I do have a reputation of a sort of a, apocalypticist, if there is such a. But somebody has to play that role, right? And so in my I can't even say it, my apocalyptic moments, I really do feel I can defend the following statement, that within 30 years, there will be the number of people in South Asia able to read the classical literatures of that great country will have reached a statistical zero. I think I can defend that. Now, my data, it's very hard to get data in India, very hard to get data. But it's largely anecdotal. But I've got a lot of anecdotes. I mean, I go to India all the time. I organize workshops all the time. I ask people all the time, who's doing what? Nobody's doing anything. There are some exceptions. But I think the situation is profoundly serious. And the time is coming where the historical patrimony of India is going to be located, the custodians of that patrimony are going to be located outside of India. I'm not sure that's a very good thing. So, the philological. Now, let me just go on to my last section, and I've got about 15 minutes, because I was told to do this for an hour, and I think I will stop at exactly an hour. But I want to. So that's my complaint, right? The non-West has been exiled from large portions of the university. It just doesn't matter. We get data sets from Africa, and we'll just run our data set analyses. We don't need anybody who knows anything about Africa. Like they say, AID, Agency for International Development, when they did a field study, they'd fly over the country. That's how they did a field study of Zimbabwe or something. So that's my sense of the non-West, my sense of the non-modern. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about that. I'm very puzzled by the problem. Jameson is onto something. This is a metaphysical problem almost, and it's deeply tied up with some Benjaminian sense of the transformation of time. Much bigger than all of us, but somehow the past just doesn't count. The past, die Vergangenheit vergangen ist. It's just gone. Now, let me revert to Milak for 1 second. It's a slightly boring topic, but Milak is, for me, the epicenter of all of these problems. It's the place where those exiled from the social sciences wound up. It's the place where those who are worried about textual practices, philology, the practices of understanding text, as I like to define it, are located. And we all are there. We don't know what to do with each other. We have no idea what to do with each other. We've all been swept. I should have said this. When we were considering names for our department, we really should have called ourselves Les Damnés de la Terre Académique. That's what we should have called ourselves, the wretched of the academic earth. And we're all there, and now they say, play together nicely, build a program, build a department, train students, build a discipline. So we've decided that we're post-disciplinary. I mean, when you're handed a lemon, you make lemonade, right? Now, I'm being facetious. Let me just say we've got some of the best people in the world in MILAC. It's an astonishing assemblage of brilliant people. But we just can't see what the future is. And so, the compulsion, the obligation, the moral responsibility of thinking about disciplinarity is our fate. So let me just think with you. This is the weakest part of this already slightly weak talk, but this is the weakest part. What is the next step, really? I'm not going to go into the impossible program of Milak. I mean, we published a self-study recently, which I helped write. I was rereading. I said, we actually wrote that? We would have to have a whole university to do comparative epistemologies of modernity. To do, I mean, it's just, Mesas brings into a single department specialists in the fields of textual hermeneutics and literary studies, of intellectual history and exploration of the structures and systems of knowledge before the coming of the modern regimes of thought, analyzing the nature of the great epistemic ruptures of the modern world, of historical changes in the configuration of social power, through the critical study of modern state institutions in very different social ecologies. This is the vision of the damned, of the desperate and the damned. What do you do? I mean, you bring graduate students to the program. What do you do? This is not stupid. This is not. These are brilliant. I mean, this document was written by Sudipto Kaviraj, Tim Mitchell, and me, trying to make sense. Tim Mitchell, the great historian of colonial Egypt, and rules of experts, and carbon democracy. Cambridge, first-class Cambridge undergrad. Terrific, brilliant guy. So we're all really kind of struggling with what forget about interdisciplinarity. I mean, that's what we are. We are a completely dysfunctional interdisciplinary unit. What we need now is the disciplinarity that is inter. I mean, what is it? What is the sense of an interdisciplinary program when you have no disciplines to connect? It's said all the time, but it's so patently absurd. So what is the solution? I mean, there's a sense, and I think, this rather silly game of kind of etymology that now passes for a form of knowledge. So part of the critique of disciplinarity had to do was sort of a Foucauldian joke, that disciplines are places to get punished. Discipline and punish, right? That's what disciplines are. They punish you. And Monsieur Jameson speaks of in that same article. We've got to destroy the boundaries of the bourgeois disciplines. Well, I have news for Fred. Philology is not a bourgeois discipline. What I want to think about in the last 10 minutes of the presentation is what might a new disciplinary form of philology look like? I think the I don't want to lose this one. I think the current sites where philology is located. We were talking about this with mathematics. Mathematics is ubiquitous in the social science. Right? Everybody wants to be a mathematician. You've got political scientists who think they're mathematicians, economists, bogus economists who think they're mathematicians. I have to tell you a story. I don't care if we run over. So, after the World Trade Centers were attacked, crazy people in the United States who get to speak before Congress more than anybody else, they reproached Middle East studies for not predicting. Yeah, there was an attempt to cut area studies funding, whatever funding was left, because we failed to predict, or I'm not a Middle East studies person, failed to predict the attack on the World Trade Center. Now I submit to you, let us turn our attention to the predictive science of economics. Not only did they not predict the meltdown, they caused it. They caused it. Anyway, that was a slight digression. I wrote this article recently. Some of you may have read it on Future Philology, and I want to think about. Nobody has, as I said to Bert the other day, nobody has given me the keys of Columbia University and said, rearrange all the offices. You said, go ahead, just do whatever you want. Mix and match, create new departments. Nobody's actually offered me that opportunity. But if I were to be offered that opportunity, I'm beginning to think that one of the departments I would create would be a department of philology. Philology is not a bourgeois discipline. Philology is as foundational a discipline as philosophy or mathematics. Philology has been coextensive with the study of language. And language has been studied everywhere, at all times. Oralists, by the way, would be in my philology department, as well as digital people. The importance, the disciplinary centrality of philology equals the disciplinary centrality of philosophy, thought reflecting on itself, language reflecting on itself. And the reason I really do think that such a department is needed is because all the other kinds of locations of philology are increasingly inhospitable. For example, there used to be a great department called Romance Philology at Columbia. It's now called French Studies, and it appoints soft, anthro-type people to. That's fine, but the philological side of Romance Studies. Departments like my own at Chicago, where we tried to, it was like a zoo of endangered species at Chicago. Tragically, I lost my dear colleague Norman Cutler, the great Tamil scholar. Try to find a Tamil scholar in the year 2000. Try to find a Bangla scholar who has the deep, I'm talking about 800 years of literary knowledge, or a Telugu person. Keeping that department going was like running through mud or something. It was just so my vision, the point of such a department is partly a result of this whole disciplinary meltdown, but also the fact that the current locations of philology are themselves inhospitable. Now, let me just take my last 5 minutes to describe this little new philology department. The key objective of a quest to understand text, the key objective is to ensure the preservation of reading works in the original language. That's the absolute sine qua non of a philology department. But it must include the whole history of the embodiments of textual knowledge, from the transition from the oral to what I've called script mercantilism, the transition from script mercantilism to print capitalism, the transition from print capitalism, we don't have a good name for this, late capitalist digitry. I urge you to read a piece by Jerry McCann in TLS, I don't know if it's out yet, on philology in the digital age, but it's some very central issues in our access to the human literate record are now very much on the table. The nature and function of commentaries, the history of reading practices that commentaries reveal, the conception and development of local understandings of language, meaning, genre, and discourse, the contest between local and superlocal forms of textuality, the kinds of socio-textual communities that produce, circulate, reproduce texts, the development and nature of interpretive protocols, perhaps most importantly, the contested histories of textual meaning. You see, my big vision, which we talked about on Tuesday, is that philology really is about three types of interpretation, three types of truth. The truth of the text, the truth of the reception of the text over time, and the present truth of the interpreter. These three components, sort of Bourdieu and Gadamer, and Gramsci, all wrapped into a single practice. I could go on with describing what I think this philology department might be, but you can see what it would do. It would subsume all the national philology programs. They'd be gone. It would subsume the regional language, regional text programs. They'd be gone. It would subsume comparative literature, which is simply epiphenomenal on philology. It does not deserve a discipline by itself. It would subsume the theory and practice of hermeneutics and a whole range of other things. Now, let me just say that there's a sense in which I get a very distinct sense that philologists will either hang together or they will hang separately. And whether this vision is the one that should be enacted or not, I don't really know, but my sense is, if I could just revert very briefly to this essay I wrote recently, that if you were going to list criteria for entry into the sanctum sanctorum of disciplinarity in the 21st century university, you would have to have a number of qualifications. This discipline would have to have a historical self-criticism of its own construction. A historical self-criticism, self-analysis of its own disciplinary construction. Economics would therefore be thrown out of the university, because economics has no such self-criticism. It would have to be a global practice. The disciplinary practices would have to be global. Of course, philology is the winner in that game, but it would have to be not just local forms of thought that pretend to universality, like political science, but it would have to be a discipline that opened itself up to the global nature of politics in a way that political science doesn't. It would have to be pluralistic. It would have to take the possibility very seriously that there are multiple kinds of truth. There's not a singular Columbia economics department. There are multiple forms of truth, and there are multiple grades of truth as well. I mean, I absolutely do think, as I said the other day, we can really determine the correct reading of a text. We can do that. But we also can determine that other people have had other readings of the text which have had historical effects, which are real and true. Falsehoods can be true. False readings can have truth. Those truths we have to recover as well. So this matter of a kind of reflexivity, globality, pluralism have got to be components of a new disciplinary formation. Now, I will just take 2 minutes of your time, and I'll end. Now, you could say, why bother with all this stuff? Who really cares about this stuff? I mean, why is this stuff important? Why is the non-modern, the non-Western, the philological important? Well, I have four. Just bear with me just for 2 minutes, and I'll give you 4 reasons. I won't explain them, but I'll give you 4 reasons. The first has to do with what it means to be a human being and learning how to be a human being. And learning a language that's distant from you is learning being in language. That's point 1 sub 1. Point 1 sub 2 is Gramsci's arguments about the radical nature of conservative education. The amazing discipline of the non-instrumental and the non-self-interested. Number 2, the question of historical memory. Who owns it? Who controls it? Who has access to it? If we philologists give that up, if there were not here, that access is given over to the Sri Ram Sena or some other loony saffron crazies. I'm talking about India now. I'm sure Cambridge has its own crazies. 3, the possibility of acquiring tools for learning. Tools for living, excuse me. Tools for living. What does that mean, tools for living? The possibility that the past, destroyed by capitalism and westernization, may have contained something that's of use to us, something purposeful, something meaningful to us, some alternative visions of social life or political life. And finally, the sheer fact that the past, especially the non-Western past, especially the Indian past, embodies 3,000 years of the collective labor of very brilliant people, which are embedded in these texts. We lose philology, we lose that. But if you are confronted with somebody who says, what does all of that mean? You just quote Nietzsche. When in doubt, quote Nietzsche. And what does Nietzsche say? Philology, he says, is the incomparable art of reading well, which is the prerequisite for all systematic knowledge. So if we lose philology, we lose that. Thank you very much.